And again, our Humanists in Action team does the programs for social action. And we have a social action program coming up involving one of the organizations that we support. For the legislation that they believe is necessary to help these folks parachute back into civilian life comfortably. So that's really what we are: secular values and humanists in action, lifelong learning, camaraderie, community service. Those are really our values. So if you're interested, it's only $40 a month, and that's not very much in these days. Can't hear? What did I say, a month? Okay, we're changing it to $40 a month. So it's going to be $40 a year. Thanks for catching that. And if you think about it, that's really, what is it, $3.33 a month? A cup of coffee at Starbucks? Or it's what, 81 cents a week? Surely people have 81 cents of discretionary income they could use for a great organization such as ours that does all the things that we do. And we're going to talk about Day of Reason when I introduce Suzanne, and all the various programs. Like when you came in this afternoon, you weren't charged anything. All of our programs are free. This programs are free. All the programs that we have, the dozens of programs that we have per month, they're all free. So if you join us at $40 a year, you'll be able to underwrite us, you'll be able to support us. And we also have donation jars out there, so if you don't want to be a member, but you believe in what we're doing, donate. And we would really appreciate that. So unless I forgot something, I'm going to ask Suzanne to come up here to talk about a couple of things and also to introduce our speaker. Suzanne Perry, our former vice president, she's still on the board, and she organizes our Day of Reason event.
Good afternoon, everybody. In addition to mentioning the Day of Reason, which will be taking place on May 5th at the state capitol, I wanted to alert you to the fact that we have just published a newly designed website, and it has a lot more detail about our programs and our events. So especially if you're new and want to know more about us, take a look at www.humanistmn.org. As for the Day of Reason, it takes place at the state capitol. We invite legislators and other advocacy groups and humanists and free thinkers from all over the state to come and support the principle of separation of religion and government. So save the date, May 5th. Now to Sam Kean, today's speaker, who's come in from Washington, D.C. I actually worked with Sam briefly in roughly 2007, 2008. We were both reporters at a newspaper called the Chronicle of Philanthropy. Sam left the paper, but in 2010, I started hearing his name a lot and seeing his name in the press because he'd written a best-selling book about a subject you might not think would have popular appeal, the periodic table of the elements. The book was called The Disappearing Spoon, and it showcased Sam's gift at storytelling, in this case featuring personalities and dramas behind iodine, radium, cadmium, and so forth. Since then, Sam has written 5 other books about subjects, including DNA, neurosurgery, and the air that we breathe. Today, he's going to discuss his most recent book, The Icepick Surgeon, Murder, Fraud, Sabotage, Piracy, and Other Dastardly Deeds Perpetrated in the Name of Science. I've read the book. It's really a good read. So as Harlan mentioned, if you want to buy it, it'll be available afterwards. In addition to authoring books, Sam has written for a wide range of publications. His work has been featured on public radio programs, including Science Friday and Radio Lab. Finally, a couple of personal tidbits about Sam. His official bio says that he spent years collecting mercury from broken thermometers as a kid. So his interest in science started quite young. Second, he has a Minnesota connection. Sam graduated from the University of Minnesota with degrees in physics and English literature. And we're very happy to welcome Sam back to Minnesota. And now here's Sam.
Is this live? I just want to mention that about the books for sale. They're coming at a great discount. We got a 20% volume discount. You don't have to pay Minnesota sales tax, which is 8.25%. So it's a great deal. So please, and after Sam's presentation, we're going to have a question and answer period, which will last for about a half an hour. Then we're going to have the book signing. So please, look at those books. They're great bargains. They're new books. They're not used books. So please help Sam, help us, and purchase those books.
Okay. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining me this afternoon. It's very, very nice to be back in Minnesota. So first slide, please. Oh, sorry, second slide. One more. There we go. So I'm going to start with a quote by Albert Einstein. Most people say that it is the intellect which makes a great scientist. Slide. They are wrong. It is character. And I admit the first time I read this quote, I mean, it's Einstein. I assumed you had to take it very seriously and so on. But the first time I read it, it kind of baffled me. Because, I didn't want scientists to be jerks or anything. But to me, what did it really matter if they were, kind-hearted or whatever? Discoveries. That's what I thought was really the most important thing. If they were making good discoveries, they were a good scientist. And that's, I thought, period. I thought that's all that really mattered. Now, I'm going to circle back to this quote at the end. But I wanted to start here because I have really changed my mind about this quote. I kind of get it now. And what changed my mind was writing this book, The Icepick Surgeon. So if you could slide. Nope. Well, I'll get to that in a second. So I've never quite written a book like this. If you've read my other books, they are full of funny, strange, spooky stories from the periodic table or the human brain or whatever. This book has a bit more of an edge to it. It's a bit darker. It's about sort of the forbidden side of science. It's packed full of stories about piracy, espionage, fraud, sabotage, grave robbing, torture, murder, and more. And some of the names that come up are people you might expect in these circumstances. People like the Unabomber, or Nazi doctors, spies on the Manhattan Project. But some of the other names might surprise you. People like Alexander Hamilton, or Thomas Edison, or even Cleopatra. And overall, the book aims to fuse the drama of scientific discovery with the lurid thrill of a true crime tale. But there is another side to these stories as well. It's not just men and women behaving badly. It dissects science itself and tries to see why discoveries are not all that counts in science. So I'm going to start with kind of a wild story. Think back to your American history class in high school. I remember there was always one section on various rebellions in the early republic. There was Shays' Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, and honestly, raise your hand if you can remember one thing about those rebellions. I remember nothing about any of them. But honestly, I wish there was one group of rebellions in early American history they had taught us about, the anatomy rebellions, or more commonly called the anatomy riots. So, slide. So the cause of these riots was pretty simple. Back then, people did not donate their bodies to science, and dissecting a body was considered kind of taboo. People said it was shameful to have your body cut up because then you wouldn't be whole on Judgment Day when God was going to raise you up from the grave. So there are theological issues as well. But that did introduce some tension, that taboo, because doctors needed to study the body in order to fix people, to heal diseases. I mean, imagine being a doctor trying to heal a body and having no idea what its parts are like or how it fits together. That would be a pretty difficult job. It would be like being a car mechanic and not being allowed to look under the hood, and then all of a sudden being thrown in the pit of the Indianapolis 500 and having to fix these motors. That's essentially what these doctors were doing. They had no idea how the body looked or how its parts were fit together if they could not dissect bodies. So this tension arose because doctors needed bodies to study, but people did not want to donate their bodies to be dissected. So the doctors got a little dirty. They started robbing graves. Slide. So in the book, I explain this in a little more detail, but the doctors often let medical students do this. The students would basically get drunk, they would go out at night, and they would rob the graves of any fresh grave. They would go in and they would rob it. Other doctors, though, they decided to employ professionals, groups of thieves they called resurrectionists who would dig up the bodies for them. And there were groups of men and women. They played kind of different roles. The women were actually a bit more on the crafty side of things. They were the ones kind of going undercover. They would pretend to work as nurses at hospitals or, hospices, care facilities, things like that. And they would tip the grave robbers off when old so-and-so was about to croak. Or sometimes they would linger at funerals and they would pretend to console people and stuff, but actually they were kind of watching where they were going to bury the body, and especially watching if people were going to booby trap the graves, which they often did. They would put explosives in there, stuff like that, to prevent the graves from being robbed. So the women would tip them off and say, look, there's a booby trap in that one, watch out. So the women would sell this information to the groups of thieves. And then these thieves, they had to be pretty clever. Some of them became sort of amateur astronomers. They had to chart the moon when the moon was going to be up, so they wouldn't be out when the moon was shining. They wanted to go at the darkest part of night to stay undercover. But when it was maximally dark out, they would sneak into the graveyard and they would steal the body. A professional group could get it up in about 10 or 15 minutes. They were very, very good, very efficient at what they were doing. Then they would throw it over their shoulder, bundle it off, and they would knock on a doctor's door at 2 or 3 a.m. Then they would sell the body to him. And this is really where the trouble started. Because as you can imagine, people were pretty angry when their uncles and grandmothers and children would suddenly go missing. Resurrectionists regularly got beaten, thrown in jail, whipped with wires, things like that. They were not very popular in the community. One mob actually displayed what I think was a fairly keen sense of irony in that they captured someone and tried to throw him back in the grave that he had just robbed and tried to bury him alive in this grave, which would have been a fitting punishment at least. But one case of revenge in New York would become particularly infamous. It started off with a young medical student, and he was dissecting a woman one day when a bunch of street kids started peeking in the window. Slide. And you can imagine why these kids were basically excited. They were little kids, and I mean, this is a real-life dead body. They were wowed by this. But you can also imagine why the student was annoyed. He was trying to study to become a doctor. He just wanted to work, and these kids were, taunting him, tapping on the window, stuff like that. So eventually the student got sick of this, and he played sort of a crass joke. He picked up the arm of the dead woman and kind of waved it at them like, yoo-hoo. And then he said, this is your mother, I just dug her up, har har. Unfortunately, one of the boys had just lost his mother. So he bursts into tears, he starts crying, he runs home to his father. His father says, what's wrong, consoles him. The boy kind of blubbering, says what happened. And the father gets angry, he gets upset about this. He grabs a shovel, he marches off to the graveyard, starts digging, and when he gets to the bottom, he finds exactly what he expected. Nothing. The woman's body had been stolen. Now, we don't know exactly whether the student had robbed the grave of this woman. She might have been working on someone else, but regardless, the woman's body had been stolen by someone. And so in some sense, it really didn't matter. Someone had stolen her body. So the husband got mad, starting to go around to his neighbors, getting them riled up. They grabbed their pitchforks, they grabbed their torches, whatever they had, and they decided they were going to march on the hospital. And when they arrived, the doctors did not exactly put up a brave front. They panicked. They were jumping out the windows, sneaking out the back door. One of them crawled inside a chimney to hide in there while they were running around. And the people in the mob, they basically trashed the hospital. They took the equipment out in the street and started smashing it. They dragged any bodies outside to rebury them. They essentially destroyed the hospital. But that wasn't enough to slake their anger. By the next day, the mob had grown to 5,000 people marching around the streets. And soon they decided to march on Columbia University to destroy the medical school there. Slide. And Alexander Hamilton himself had to stand on the steps of Columbia University and beg them not to destroy the hospital. He was the only thing standing between them and destroying Columbia University. And I guess he was well-liked enough where they did back down. They did not destroy that one, but they kept marching around to other places, marauding, destroying things, doing whatever they could. Now, by this point, the mayor of town had actually rounded all the doctors up and thrown them into jail. Not to punish them, but because the jail was the stoutest building in town. He was trying to protect them. While the mob heard this, they surrounded the building. They started throwing things, smashing windows, tearing down the fences, screaming, "Bring out your doctors!" They were not going to rest until they had gotten their revenge on the doctors. Eventually, the mayor called in the militia, as well as some other local famous politicians, slide, including John Jay. And John Jay tried to be Alexander Hamilton, tried to tell the people to calm down, to stop. But I guess he did not have the magic touch that Hamilton did. John Jay was a very big blue blood, and people said, well, what does he know about having his loved one's graves robbed? And eventually someone threw a brick, and it hit John Jay right in the head, cracked his skull, and he went down bloody in a heap. Other politicians, the same thing happened. They were throwing stuff at them. And eventually, in all this confusion, all the chaos, things flying around, the militia ended up, sadly, opening fire on the crowd. At least 7 people died, and maybe up to 20. So this all started with one dead body, and it ended with many more. And I think this is a really fascinating story for several reasons. I mean, first of all, it's kind of completely forgotten. It's much more exciting than Shays' Rebellion or the Whiskey Rebellion or whatever. I mean, this really has a lot of great elements to it. Grave robbing, Alexander Hamilton, mobs, gunfire. It's really, really a juicy story. But I also think it's fascinating because you can kind of make a case for both sides here. On the one hand, there were the everyday people. They didn't want their loved ones' graves robbed. Slide. They didn't want their relatives chopped up and discarded. And this burden fell especially heavily on the poorest parts of society. You were much more likely to have your grave robbed if you were black or if you were Native American, or if you were an immigrant from Ireland or Germany or something like that. You were far more likely to have your grave robbed in those situations. These people had every right to be mad. Still, you could make a case for the doctors too. The burdens for diseases now and back then, they almost always fell most heavily on the poor. And the more the doctors understood diseases, the more they could help these people, the more they could help the poor. But they couldn't learn anything without dissecting the body. So there really was this tension here. And this tension lasted for a long time. It never really went away. There were at least 16 anatomy riots in the early United States before the Civil War. You had them in Cleveland, Philadelphia, Baltimore, St. Louis, just over and over and over, these same things erupted in different cities. And believe it or not, we're still dealing with some of these tensions today. Bodies are still being stolen and chopped up, especially internationally. They call this not the black market, but the red market. And again, it's usually the poor who suffer, but not always. If you remember the old Masterpiece Theater on public television, well, Alistair Cook, the host, believe it or not, after he died, his body got stolen and chopped up for parts. So this thing happens to lots and lots of people, and it's still happening today. So again, these tensions are still with us. That's one thing I did strive to do in the book, is to show how these stories are still affecting science today. These stories take place in the 1600s, the 1700s, but there's always something going on that links it back to tensions and other things going on today. Because the sins of science are not all safely buried, sadly, in the past. So admittedly, that was a bit of a heavy story, but not all of the tales in the Icepick Surgeon are so dark. There's one section about piracy that has some kind of rollicking fun in it. There's a section about crimes in the future that is also fun in a way. How we might use advanced artificial intelligence or CRISPR genetic editing to wreak havoc. So kind of looking in the future, a little science fiction-y there. But the best example of kind of a lighthearted, dastardly deed, if that's not an oxymoron, the next example is probably the best example of that in the book. So, slide. So this story involves these two fellows right here, Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope. These two were paleontologists. They were dinosaur bone hunters. And they got involved in something called the Bone Wars in the mid-1800s. So for some context, in the mid-1800s, no one had ever really heard of dinosaurs. They'd been discovered fairly recently, and they were just kind of some obscure taxon of lizards. No one really cared about them. It was really Marsh and Cope that made dinosaurs dinosaurs, the thing that every kid rushes into a museum and their eyes light up when they see these giant things. They were the ones who made dinosaurs dinosaurs. And Marsh and Cope actually started off as friends. They were both young American paleontologists traveling in Europe in the mid-1800s, and they ran across each other in Berlin. Marsh was studying there. Cope was trying to get over this torrid love affair that he'd had back in the States. And they hit it off. They became friends. In fact, when they returned to the United States, they even started naming species after each other. An extinct reptile, an extinct amphibian. And I think that's kind of sweet. That's how paleontologists show affection, is they name species after each other. So it was a very nice thing for them to do. But personality-wise, they were just too different to stay friends. Cope was always very smooth and friendly. He was a glad-hander, but he had kind of a quick temper. He could blow up at you at the slightest provocation. Marsh was always more awkward, pretty clumsy guy. The one example I remember is that he once wrote a love letter to a woman he was trying to woo. And in the letter, he praised the woman that he was courting as, quote, the prettiest little vertebrate that he had ever seen in his life. And she didn't go for it, amazingly. I don't know why. But frankly, they were just two different people. So they clashed. They were not going to be friends. This especially happened when Cope started making some amazing discoveries in a quarry pit in New Jersey. Slide. He found the first full dinosaur skeletons in North America. This is a hadrosaur right here. Well, Marsh was jealous of this. He wanted to make some discoveries of his own. So one day after Cope had generously taken him around, showed him the pit where he found all these dinosaurs, very, very generous in opening up his dig site to Marsh, Marsh pretended he was going back to the train station to go back home, doubled back to the pit, got a wad of money out of his pocket, and bribed the owner of the quarry pit to start taking the bones and sending them to him instead of his good friend. So completely backstabbed his friend so that he would get the best bones in the future. So Cope found out about this. They started to get mad at each other. Then this kind of battle started between them. They started pointing out each other's errors in publications in very snarky terms. And then things got especially heated, and they turned from not just, ex-friends to outright enemies when they started looking for fossils in the American West. Now, it's actually kind of hard for us to imagine nowadays the fossil bonanza that was the American West at the time, from about western South Dakota out to Utah or so. In many cases, there were just bones lying on the ground, just huge dinosaur bones lying in the open. There's a story of a shepherd in Wyoming who actually built a log cabin out of old dinosaur bones because there were so many just sitting there. That's how many that were out there. Slide. Well, as paleontologists, Marsh and Cope, they wanted in on this bonanza. So they began organizing teams to go out there and to start digging. And this is where their rivalry exploded, out in the Wild West. Because the two teams, Marsh's team and Cope's team, they would see each other in the distance sometimes. They would kind of start circling each other like kids at the playground. So sometimes one group, they would sneak up onto a bluff and they would hurl rocks down on the people digging below or push boulders off. Other times they would sneak into the camp and they would actually steal bones from the other people. Or they'd plant false bones to try to trick them into thinking they'd made a discovery, something like that. They'd go undercover, pose as traveling salesmen to go into their camp and start spying around. In at least one case, the rival groups pulled guns on each other, threatened to shoot each other. One team even dynamited a dig site when they couldn't take any more bones, just blew all the extra bones to smithereens, just so that the rival group could not come in and sweep up these bones. They were playing for keeps here. They did not like each other. They would do whatever it took to prevent the other group from getting a little bit of glory. But here's the thing I really find interesting about this rivalry. It's pretty darn heated, but it ended up benefiting science overall. Because each team had its rival, they pushed themselves much harder. They worked a lot harder than they would have, all because they didn't want their enemy getting any of the glory. They really pushed themselves because they had that rival at their back. They excavated literal tons of fossils every single summer. There were whole train cars full of fossils they were shipping back and shipping to museums around the country. So really a lot of different places benefited from this rivalry. And these were truly the most spectacular discoveries anyone had ever seen. Slide. In between them, Cope and Marsh discovered so many, slide please, discovered so many iconic species. They discovered the Triceratops, the Stegosaurus, the Brontosaurus, or what we now call the Apatosaurus. As I mentioned before this, no one really knew what dinosaurs were. And suddenly, thanks to Cope and Marsh, they became the most famous animals, some of the most famous animals of all time. And frankly, I admit I find all this hilarious in kind of a sophomoric way. But it is a good reminder that rivalries can benefit people sometimes. They can push you and make you work harder. And it's a good reminder that not all the stories of scientific misdeeds are dark. There is some fun mischief mixed in there as well. Now, for the final story I wanted to address this afternoon, I'm going to talk about the title story for this book, the so-called Icepick Surgeon. And it's a bit of a strange case because it involves someone who obviously sinned quite grievously, mostly due to his ambition, his outsized ambition. But partly he sinned as well because he wanted to help his patients too much. Slide. So this story involves this man right here, Dr. Walter Freeman, who prevented an operation called the lobotomy. And in doing so, he became probably the most reviled doctor in American history, and maybe even the most reviled doctor in all of history, next to Nazi doctor Joseph Mengele. So Freeman started off in medicine in the 1930s in Washington, D.C. And for a while, he was leading something of a double life there. Part of the time, he was a professor at George Washington University. And by all accounts, he was an electrifying teacher. He absolutely wowed students with his enthusiasm. He was like a circus performer, essentially. He would strut into the classroom with a diamond-tipped cane. He had a sombrero on his head that he'd gotten on a trip to Mexico. And he'd do these little tricks for them. Like he'd take one piece of chalk in one hand, and he was ambidextrous, so he could take another piece of chalk in the other hand. And he would start drawing two different brain structures simultaneously on the board with different hands at the same time. I mean, he really was like a circus performer. And the students, they absolutely ate it up. They loved them. Some of them even brought their boyfriends and girlfriends along to attend class because he was so exciting. They said he was better than the movies. And Freeman sometimes got stuck teaching classes on early Saturday mornings, but it didn't matter. Every class he ever taught was packed, even on a Saturday morning. He was that entertaining. So this was the good side of Freeman's life, the happy side for him. The bad side was his other job, because he also worked at an insane asylum. Slide. And most insane asylums then were truly dismal places. They were simply awful. Mostly because there was no way they could treat the worst patients. If you were psychotic, or you were seeing visions, or you had a break with reality, doctors had zero drugs. They had zero treatments. There was basically nothing they could do. What they usually did was lock people in straitjackets, throw them in a padded room, and then confine them there. Some of the people couldn't even have furniture because they would break it and they'd attack themselves or they would attack other people. Some of them couldn't have clothes because they would rip them off their bodies or they would soil them repeatedly. Many of them couldn't even go outside or just have a meal with someone. They were that psychotic. So they sat in these loud, crowded, filthy asylums day after day, year after year, and there was nothing doctors like Freeman could do. And this appalled Walter Freeman. All that wasted potential, all those wasted lives, it agonized him. And then, in the mid-1930s, like a bolt from the blue, came what he thought was going to be their salvation. A doctor in Portugal developed a procedure that eventually became known as the lobotomy. The basic idea of the lobotomy was to disconnect two different parts of the brain. You wanted to separate the emotional centers in the center of the brain from the reasoning centers in the front of the brain. And the theory at the time was that mental disturbances were the result of the emotional centers getting too revved up and overwhelming the reasoning parts of the brain. The emotional centers were running out of control, running amok. So if you severed the connections between the emotional centers and the reasoning centers, the theory was that these people could gain a little bit of control over their thinking, and you could help them out. Now, nowadays we know that that's too simple, and I talk about this a little bit more in the book, but there's actually been kind of a revolution in neuroscience over the past half century or so, where we now realize that emotions are actually critical to good logical thinking. People who have who have these disconnections actually are very, very poor reasoners. They do not reason well. They do not reason like normal people do. So emotions are actually a very important part of reasoning, but they just didn't realize this at the time. And they thought that these lobotomies were going to help for a few reasons. So in the original lobotomies, you would open up a dime-sized wafer in the skull on both sides, and then you would do various things to sever the connections. Maybe put, some sort of like dull knife down there, inject alcohol to kill the brain cells, something like that. So you'd sever the emotional connections and you would calm these people down. And there were cases where people did have their emotions kind of revving up and running out of control. And when doctors tried lobotomies on these cases, these most desperate cases, as an absolute last resort, these people were calmer afterwards. Slide. Now, to be sure, this did not cure these people. There probably wasn't a way to cure them. But at least the people after the lobotomies were not as tortured as before. They could do simple things like go outside and feel the sun on their face, or just sit down and have a meal with someone. So in these really desperate cases, as an absolute last resort, lobotomies were defensible in the late 1930s. The problem was, though, that Walter Freeman was not content to let them be a last resort. He was too ambitious, and he wanted them to be the first line of defense against mental illness. And to Freeman, there were a couple of problems with lobotomies. And the biggest one was that lobotomies were a full invasive brain surgery. You had to open up the skull, like I mentioned, so you needed a neurosurgeon on hand, there was a lot of equipment, you needed an anesthesiologist. They just took a lot of time. They were a slow procedure. But Freeman looked around at the whole United States, and there were something like 1 million people in asylums at that time. He wanted to help them all. And he knew neurosurgery was simply too slow to be able to help these people. So he started looking for a shortcut. And one day, in his kitchen, he found it. He opened up his kitchen drawer, and there he saw an ice pick. And he instantly realized, this is the way Walter Freeman thought, he instantly realized that he could do neurosurgery with this ice pick. Now, if you are squeamish, I suggest you not look at this next picture. I'm serious, because this is what Walter Freeman decided to do with that ice pick. Slide. Okay. So Freeman realized when he saw the ice pick that he could access the brain in a different way. He could slip that ice pick through the eye socket on the very inside of the eye, and the bone behind the eye socket is fairly thin. And he could access the brain that way, sever the connections to the emotional centers, and give the patients a very quick, very short lobotomy. Slide. Now, to be clear, Freeman did not use this ice pick his whole career. He later developed other tools. But during his first few surgeries in his office in Washington, D.C., he did actually use the ice pick from his kitchen drawer to perform this surgery. And he actually had to sneak patients up. He couldn't let the other doctors in the office see this because it wasn't sterile in his office. He was just performing them, on the couch in his office. He had no business doing this. And after Freeman perfected this surgery in his office, he decided to take this show on the road. He began driving around the country to different asylums in rural states like West Virginia or South Dakota, places like that. He called these his headhunting expeditions. And most every day on these road trips was pretty much the same for him. He would get up on early summer day at a campground somewhere. He liked to stay at campgrounds. And Freeman was actually a barbiturate addict, so he would shake off the hangover of the previous night's barbiturates that he'd taken to get to sleep, and then he would wake up and he would drive to the next asylum, arriving probably about mid-morning or so, and he would give a lecture there. And then they would have lunch. And then after lunch, the show would start. And Freeman always made sure that it was a show. He would invite local reporters in. He would invite anyone in the community, and anyone could come see him do this surgery. Then he would line up a dozen or so patients, and he would go down the line doing one operation after another, one lobotomy, like an assembly line, essentially. You can see an example of that here. And I don't know if you can see it well, but in the time of COVID, one thing jumps out immediately about this surgery, and what is that? He's not wearing a mask or gloves or anything like that. Freeman said, he didn't believe in all that germ crap, as he put it. And look at what a circus this is. And look at how many people are here looking over this. But he loved the show. So he'd be there cracking wise the whole time, trying to entertain them like he did his students. And in fact, remember I mentioned how he could draw two different structures with both hands at the same time on the chalkboard? Well, he developed a way where he could take one stiletto in each hand and do ambidextrous lobotomies on people just to show off for reporters. He thought it was a great trick, so he'd do that over and over. And sometimes people in the audience would get woozy. They would pass out. They would faint. Then Freeman would cackle, and he'd say, "I've made more people swoon than Frank Sinatra." He loved that joke. And he would just travel around the country doing operation after operation like this. Probably his most famous case involved the Kennedy family. You might know that President John F. Kennedy had a younger sister named Rosemary. Slide. She is on the right there. And Rosemary actually had a pretty harrowing birth. There was no doctor on hand during the birth. The doctor was running late. And this sounds incredible, but the midwife at the time decided to try to push the baby. The baby was coming out. She decided to push the baby back inside to wait for the doctor to get there. And unfortunately, this turned out to be a very bad decision because the umbilical cord got wrapped around her neck, starved her brain of oxygen for a little bit, and she ended up with some brain damage. But overall, Rosemary grew up fairly healthy. She had a little trouble learning how to ride a bike at first. She was a bit slow to speak, maybe a bit clumsy. But, otherwise, beyond a little bit of clumsiness, she was perfectly healthy. And she was often considered the prettiest Kennedy daughter. Sadly, though, her father, Joseph Kennedy, she was an embarrassment. She was not perfect, and he had to have a perfect family. There were no flaws allowed, not someone clumsy who had a little bit of brain damage. So he locked Rosemary away in a convent as a teenager. But she rebelled at this. She kept sneaking out at night. She did what any teenager would do. And so Joseph Kennedy called up Walter Freeman. They were both kind of running in the same circles in Washington, D.C., and he said that he wanted a lobotomy for Rosemary. And it was a complete disaster. Afterward, for a long time, she lost control of her bodily functions. She couldn't walk, she couldn't speak, and eventually she did recover somewhat from those symptoms. But above all, she lost what's sometimes called her spark. She lost her initiative. Before, she was high-spirited. She was fun. She loved doing things. Now she would just kind of sit there day after day, staring at the wall. She had no initiative. And Joseph Kennedy was reportedly furious at the outcome of this. I don't know what he was expecting, but he was furious about this. But he got what he wanted. He got control over his daughter. And he eventually locked her away in a ward in Wisconsin, and no one was allowed to visit, no one was allowed to talk about her. In fact, when JFK was campaigning for president in 1960, he actually had to sneak away from all the reporters and things just to visit his own sister. That's how taboo she was inside the family. But even failures like this did not stop Walter Freeman. He had a vision. He wanted to help all these people. He wanted to cure them. So he kept making these lobotomy summer road trips year after year, all across the country. He once did 25 lobotomies in a single day. That was his record. He did them mostly on women, since women, for various reasons, were more likely to end up in asylum, so most of his patients were women. But he did them also on children. Slide. Some children as young as 8 or 9 years old. He would do lobotomies on them. And overall, Freeman alone did 4,000 lobotomies by himself. And there were many, many thousands more for people he taught, his disciples around the country. And in the book, I explain a little bit more about what finally did Walter Freeman in, what led to his big downfall. But for a while, he was the most famous doctor in the United States. And he had aspirations to go even beyond being just a famous doctor. He liked to call himself the Henry Ford of lobotomies, the someone who was bringing lobotomies to the masses. He was very, very proud of this. And I can't help it. I find Freeman such a fascinating character because he really did want to help people. He really thought he was doing good for all of these people. He started off with such good intentions. But we all know what the road to hell is paved with. And this actually brings up kind of a tough question for a book like this. I'd argue that for all the damage he did, Walter Freeman wasn't sadistic. He wasn't a monster. I think it's too easy to just label someone a monster like that. But still, how can we prevent atrocities like this? Slide. And the answer, I think, goes back to that Einstein quote. Most people say that it is the intellect which makes a great scientist. They are wrong. It is character. So over the last century, science has gained a lot of power in society. And some of this power comes from big, obvious things like building and maintaining atomic bombs, very obvious things. But science also wields its power in subtler ways, everyday ways, in medicine, psychology, things like that. And I think it's becoming clearer and clearer that there's more to science than just new discoveries and spin-off technologies. Science is not disconnected from society. It's an important part of society. And character is vital for wielding that power properly. Slide. And overall, that's what this book, The Icepick Surgeon, is trying to do. Again, there are stories in here about Cleopatra, the Unabomber, Thomas Edison. It starts in ancient times and even examines the new types of crimes in the future. But above all, it's a book of stories about scientists who went rogue and why they went rogue, how exactly they broke bad and why. I talk about common blind spots among scientists, the type of psychological tricks and defenses they employ to pretend they're not doing the things they're doing. And I include some tips and tricks for making sure science is more ethical in the future. Now, don't get me wrong, I love science. I think humankind is immensely better off for science. And I think we're better off both materially and also spiritually. Just think of all the wonders about the world that science has revealed to us. But I also know that science can do better. And I hope the stories, kind of the gut punch of some of these stories, can do its part, at least a little bit, to help make science better in the future. So again, thank you all for joining me this afternoon. I appreciate it. Now, if you could go.
Okay, we're going to have as typically we do, have a Q&A session where we have an opportunity to ask Mr. Kean any questions you may have about his presentation or his books. So what we're going to do is ask folks to come up here, and if like 2 or 3 or 4 people want to ask questions, you could just sit right over here, and you could come up to the microphone. One thing I'd like to ask you is, I've been told that in order for our cameras, because we're having this beamed through YouTube today, is to look towards the window when you ask the question. I know that looks kind of strange, but that's the way science is these days. So if you have a question, please come up. The first person can get up here. Anyone else who has a question can either come up after the first person is finished, or if you could sit over here by this bench here. Okay, Jerry, you're first. Why don't you come up, ask your question?
Yeah, it's a question, kind of comment, kind of looking for a challenge in a sense. I would suggest that most scientists and philosophers of science for sure, would argue that it isn't even intellect or character, it's the collective or communal aspect of science that's the key to its success. So the fact that one person's claims are challenged by others through peer review and other things like that. And so what happened with your doctor, I mean, was there any kind of evaluation of his patients afterwards to the point where people were saying, these people don't improve, they're actually harmed by this, and if that had happened, how would he have been allowed to continue doing those operations?
Yeah, so that's a good point about science collectively, and I think you're right, that is what makes science so good, so amazing is the community aspect. I was talking a little bit more about just preventing the individual scientist going rogue and doing damaging things. But about the response of the wider medical community, there was a lot of pushback to Walter Freeman. And that's something I've mentioned it over and over in the book, that sometimes it's not fair to judge people in the past by the modern ethical precepts. But there are a lot of cases in the book where people were getting a lot of pushback at the time. And this was the case with Freeman. He was definitely getting pushback on the work he was doing. The problem was Freeman could always turn around and say, what else are we going to do for these people? Leave them in the asylum? There's nothing else we can do. So he always had that kind of ace in his pocket where he could say, what else? Do you want me to just do nothing? Do we do nothing for these people? So there was that pushback, but he always had that answer for them. And another thing I talk about in the book is he had sort of the trappings of science in his papers and things, but what he needed to do was run a controlled study where he had two groups of patients, one of them that got lobotomies, one of them that did not get lobotomies, and look at their outcome over the long term. And he or someone be blinded to which ones had actually gotten the lobotomies. And he never did a study like that, which was one of the criticisms of his work, is that he did not do a good controlled study. He would just do lobotomies on all of them and then say, oh, wow, look at how much better they got. And he was the one evaluating them. So even if it was an unconscious bias, I'm sure it was there and affecting his work. So, yeah.
So, yeah, my name's Stephanie, and I actually work in mental health, and I remember hearing these stories in undergrad and grad school, and they're pretty horrifying. But my question really is kind of more contemporary. I heard a quote about related to the pandemic I thought was really interesting, that we had gotten the medical science correct, but we hadn't gotten the social science correct, and that's why there was so much resistance to masking and vaccines. And I'm just wondering if you have any insights on, for future reference, how we could maybe do better getting the social science right.
Yeah, I really wish I did. It'd be amazing. Something you're saying, the fact that you even asked a question like that shows that you're at least thinking about the right things, I think, in that I think there was a tendency before, and maybe even still a tendency, to say all we need to do is just present the facts and just drill it home and make it very logical, and people will see the errors of their ways. And there has been evidence where, the more facts you throw at someone, in some cases, the more they dig in their heels and they get resistant to it. So it can backfire in some ways if you do that. And I think one thing to remember, I don't know if this is a solution, but one thing to at least remember is that in a lot of cases, when they believe X or Y, it's very likely that everyone in their social circle also believes X or Y, and believes it very passionately. It's not like, that they have a date wrong where you can gently correct them and they'll be like, oh, okay, there's a lot tied up in that belief. And if they reject that belief or change their mind, they're essentially rejecting their friends, their family, things like that. That is not going to be easy for them to change their mind. I don't know that there is a good solution, but until we tackle that aspect of it, that social part of it, then I really don't think it's going to be very easy to change minds on things like that.
So what finally stopped Dr. Friedman, and are lobotomies illegal today?
Do you want me to spoil what happened?
Yeah.
Spoil it? Okay. Thorazine is what stopped him, essentially. It was a drug, and finally they had another way to treat people. And they called Thorazine a chemical lobotomy in some ways, because that's kind of the paradigm they were working with. But it was actually much, much better. It was the first true antipsychotic drug, and it was reversible. I mean, it's not a nice drug, it's a harsh drug, but it's far better than having a stiletto or an ice pick in your brain. So drugs are the short answer of what stopped him.
Very interesting stuff, thank you. I have a question. If you observed a common characteristic of some of these scientists that went awry, and the context of my question is, there seems to be a parallel maybe to deeply religious people where there's an element of self-delusion or wanting to believe something in the face of contrary evidence. So is there some element of delusional thinking or self-deception that you observe across some of these cases?
Yeah, definitely self-delusion. These scientists weren't so much deluding themselves into believing something that was not true or that was demonstrably wrong. I've written about that a little bit in other books. They were blocking out the suffering that they were causing. So it's more, the one thing that came up over and over is tunnel vision. They were so focused on their science that everything else in the world fell away. All that mattered was getting the results. And that's all they really cared about. That's all they thought about was getting the results. So they kind of lost the human side of science. And science is a human activity, not only the fact that humans do it, but that, we're sort of going back to that one comment, science is a social activity in that you need to bring it out into the wider community. And when people are doing things like that, it undermines the trust that the community has in people. So it really ends up backfiring, I think, in most cases. But yeah, a little bit more tunnel vision than self-delusion, and a lot of euphemisms about what they were doing. They would call something awful by a little softer name to try to convince themselves. So maybe that was a bit more of the self-delusion along those lines.
Doesn't it sound as if...
Other people could hear you.
Okay, it sounds as if the tunnel vision scientists had fits in with the cultural influences of the day. There's a sort of a late Victorian idea that emotions are bad and reason is good, carrying on into the 20s and 30s and perhaps even today. Mm-hmm. And scientists were caught up in this, which fostered their tunnel vision, and also allowed lobotomy to be seen as something that could solve an age-old problem, how emotion can fight against reason.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, I've written about this a little bit in other places that, there was a long time this sort of antagonism between emotion and reason. Sure. But neuroscience is really moving toward the idea that emotions are very important for reason, right, and that you need emotions. They're a good guide to what's reasonable. They help us make reasonable decisions. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Well, other people are thinking of questions, and I'd like for you to do so. I'd like for you to take some time, Sam, to talk about the other books that you have authored, which we have available. Sure. Just give us a little synopsis about what they are about.
Okay. And if you're feeling shy, I'll be around for a little bit signing books and things, so you can come up and we can chat out there too. But the other books, so you can see 4 of them there, 4 of the 5. The green one there is called The Disappearing Spoon. That was my first book. That's the one that Suzanne mentioned, that the premise was to find a funny or spooky or weird story about every single element on the periodic table. So I did manage to cram all 118 of them in there, so I'm just make a cameo, but it's kind of showing you not only about the people who discovered the elements, but also how they play a role in things like art, or biology, or war. There have been wars fought over different elements, things like that. So really an expansive look at the table and all the ways it intersects in our lives in ways that you might not expect. The next book, the red cover, The Violinist's Thumb, that takes kind of a similar approach, except it looks at genetics. So essentially, until about 20 years ago, scientists knew about DNA, but they really didn't have a good way to read a lot of it or to study it in large quantities at once. It's a very slow process to read DNA. All of a sudden, Human Genome Project happened. There was this explosion of information about our DNA. And there were these stories written in our DNA that are millions or even billions of years old that suddenly we can read. We can read these age-old stories. And so it's about these stories, what we're learning about humankind, about biology, about our place in the world, based on these new things we can read in our DNA. And sort of like the other book, it looks at DNA and looks at DNA and how it intersects in places you might not expect. Things like DNA and art, DNA and archaeology. They do some amazing archaeology work with DNA nowadays. DNA and music, different things like that. So DNA's really spilled over its boundaries of medicine and it intersects a lot of different fields now. So it's kind of a big, expansive look at human DNA. The next one there with the black cover, The Tale of the Dueling Neurosurgeons. That is a book about neuroscience, obviously. And the premise there was, if you think back like 25 or so years ago, or probably even a little farther than that at this point, we didn't have MRI machines back then. We didn't have ways of looking at what's going on in the brain in real time. And basically the way neuroscientists learned about what different parts of the brain did is they waited for people to get injured in different parts of the brain, and then suddenly these people's personalities would change in these very strange but very specific ways. So some people would get injured in one part of the brain, and suddenly they couldn't recognize animals anymore. They could recognize plants just fine, tell plants apart, no problem, but dogs, raccoons, elephants, bears, whatever, all looked the same to them. They could not tell these creatures apart. So then they realized that, this little part of the brain must have something to do with recognizing animals. Then you get stories about people who, they have virus infections, gunshot wounds, different things like that. And all of a sudden they couldn't recognize family members anymore. Or they turned into chronic liars, or their emotions started revving up, doing different things like that. So basically it marches around the brain from part to part, looks at case studies of everyday individual people who suffered these accidents, diseases, whatever, and how their personalities shifted in these very strange, very specific, and very revealing ways about how the brain works. So it's a story of it's basically a collection of stories about how the brain works, teaches you how the brain works through the stories of these individual people. The fourth book I wrote is not actually up there. It's called Caesar's Last Breath, and that's a book about the atmosphere, our environment. So, you imagine taking a deep breath, inhaling all these gases. And there are the obvious ones, nitrogen, oxygen, things like that. But there's also little bits of anesthesia floating around. There's remnants of volcanoes from the very early Earth. There are noble gases. There's fallout still from radioactive bomb tests in the 1950s. All of these things are floating around in the air. So it's basically, what I say with the book is that you can take a deep breath and inhale the entire history of the world in each breath if you know about these gases, where they come from. So it's kind of a history of the world told through our breath. And the last one, I promise, is the Bastard Brigade. That's the one at the very end there, the dark cover. So this book basically looks at an offshoot of the Manhattan Project to build the atomic bomb. Because there were a lot of scientists who'd been run out of Germany, usually because they were Jewish, and they came over, were working on the Manhattan Project, and they went to the head of the Manhattan Project and they said, look, we know that Adolf Hitler, the Germans, the Nazis, have a team together working on uranium fission over there. We know this because they founded it right at the start of the war. They also have very smart scientists over there. They have the best industry in the world. We are terrified that they are going to build an atomic bomb and destroy Europe with it. So in response to this fear of the Nazi atomic bomb, the US put together this group of kind of misfit commandos and scientists and sent them undercover into Europe to spy on, sabotage, and in some cases even assassinate members of the Nazi atomic bomb project. So it's about these scientists, the military leaders, and them running around Europe and the adventures that they had there. So that is a quick summary of each of my books. I think someone was coming up.
So you've studied a lot about scientists and where we should go with it, and you talk about the importance of character. Science is a human endeavor, and so it's always about what we choose to do with our knowledge, like just anything goes. And so what have you learned about that? Because, well, of course, there's the atomic bomb. That didn't really go so well for civilization. But now we have, again, with the DNA, the genetic engineering, DNA editing, our genes, technology, where technology is taking us. And people are working on all these things, and I was just wondering, from all you've studied about the past, are there any lessons? I mean, we can just go anywhere, or almost, and should we have some guardrails? What do you learn from what you've studied to where we go now with just all the possibilities that face us?
Yeah, one thing I am encouraged about is I don't think there are some scientists out there, but for the most part, scientists are thinking nowadays about the consequences of their research, especially in cases like genetic engineering, things like that. And even you start to see it in computer science with people developing artificial intelligence and things like that. There's much, much more discussion now about the consequences of that, some of the biases built into the systems, things like that. So it's encouraging that scientists are at least thinking about these things and thinking about them in a way that I've only been doing this 20 years, so I don't have as much perspective, but you didn't hear as much of that 20 or so years ago as you do now, where it's really a part of the discussion nowadays. I think there are even some grants from the federal government where you have to spend a certain amount talking about and thinking about the ethical issues involved with your research. I know the Human Genome Project, for instance, 2 or 3% of its budget, and it was a $1 billion program, 2 or 3% of its budget went toward ethical issues and trying to sort of lay these things out. So I am encouraged that there is more discussion about these kind of things. But I don't know that you can stop a rogue person, someone who's determined to do something bad. One example was the guy in China, a couple years ago at this point. He used CRISPR to edit 2 human embryos, and then they were born. 2 little girls were born. And he's currently in jail for this in China. So he got punished for this, and there was almost universal denouncement of him when he did this, but there wasn't much they could do to stop him at the time from doing those kind of things. So I'm not sure you're ever going to be able to stop individuals from misusing it, but I am encouraged at the fact that people are thinking about this a lot more than they were in the past, from what I can tell.
You have a question? I have a question that came in on my iPhone.
Okay, good.
Can you comment on from one of our members, can you comment on the Tuskegee Airmen experiments and Henrietta Lacks?
Yeah, so I do, there's a chapter about Tuskegee in my book, so it's addressed there. And it wasn't so much the airmen, it was a different group there. The airmen were, I just wanted to clarify that. So the airmen were the soldiers and pilots. The Tuskegee group was a different group where they were men, there were 400, I think, black men, who had syphilis, and they essentially just let the syphilis go and go and go to end-stage syphilis because they wanted to see what would happen with end-stage syphilis. And yeah, I talk about it in the book and the horrible consequences and how awful this was. And I sort of tie it in as well to a much less well-known study, the Guatemala study, where they were also studying STDs. And one common misconception, however bad the Tuskegee study were, the subjects there had caught syphilis on their own. They denied treatment from them, it was unethical, it was terrible, but they had caught it on their own. In the Guatemala study, they were actually giving people who did not have syphilis and gonorrhea those diseases. So in some sense, it went even farther than the Tuskegee study did. And I'm not sure why it's not well known. There's an amazing discovery story behind this. It was hidden for 50 or 60 years. And it's really a really horrifying, macabre tale of how science can go wrong, stuff like that. About Henrietta Lacks, I did not address her in the book, obviously, because there's a very famous book about this, so I didn't want to just kind of retread that. Yeah, in her case, the unethical thing was not explaining how they were going to use her cells, and for all the good they've done, there's still kind of that original sin where, yeah, they've learned some amazing things about how cells work, how cancer works, but they just didn't do that. It just wasn't something they thought of at the time, that they should tell patients how their cells are going to be used, secure the rights for it, things like that. And thankfully, that would not happen nowadays. There are much stricter rules about telling people what they can do, or giving people the option of them deciding what you can do with their cells, things like that. So that's one of the prime reasons we have these strict measures in place nowadays to prevent those kind of things from happening.
Hi, I just wonder if there's any aspect of science you haven't worked on yet that you would like to do next.
Well, I am getting going slowly on a new book about archaeology, which is a subject I haven't written about much. Always found it fascinating, but never have written too much about it. So I will be getting going on that. It'll involve a fair amount of travel, and now is not the best time to be doing that kind of thing because I want to travel internationally for it. So it's off to a slow start, but that is the next thing I'm gonna tackle. Yeah.
Okay.
Just a quick fun one, bringing it up to the modern day, science and engineering have a lot of power. There's a figure today that gets a little bit of controversy. What's your opinion of Elon Musk?
Elon Musk. So what happened? I saw there was controversy. I didn't see what happened exactly.
Oh, just whether, he's very opinionated in a lot of things. He's very influential with EVs and with SpaceX and stuff. I was just wondering if you developed an opinion on his application of science and engineering and what he's doing.
Got it. Okay. Not overall about him. I guess I have opinions about the concentration of wealth that would allow someone like him to have that much money. I've always been someone who's sort of romanticized exploring space and things like that. So I do support the rocketry programs that he and Bezos are doing, and I hope they can get those going. So I don't have strong opinions about him one way or the other, but that is one thing that I do support, and I hope those things at least do get going. Yeah.
Well, just to follow up to that, because I was thinking of him too, and Zuckerberg and these apparent geniuses, or they know how to accumulate money and have other geniuses work for them. What's your opinion about having more government regulation about these folks, as opposed to a lot of this stuff now? They accumulate this incredible amounts of wealth, and we let them do it, and then I think there's a lot more opportunity for them to go rogue. So again, based on your study of science, would we be more well advised as a society to not let these folks go rogue and have more government guidance in development of science?
So you're talking about specifically the tech plutocrats or scientists?
So, like what Elon Musk and those guys are doing. Should we have a private space program? To the extent
I don't mind
we do.
having a private space program. I think there's a lot worse things they could do with their money than build rockets and things like that. So the private space program, I don't have a problem with that. Again, the accumulation of wealth overall, I have some opinions about that. But if they're going to do a rocket program with it, I think that's really cool and exciting. So I'm excited about that aspect.
Well, I'm excited about it too, but again, I think if individuals are going ahead and with their own wealth, they can go ahead in ways that maybe don't serve society well.
Yes.
Like who benefits from this exploration? Who benefits? Who benefits? They get to decide.
Yeah. Okay. Uh-oh, now we're getting into politics, I think.
I wonder if you could
There'll be a
comment.
line of questions now.
Yeah, I wonder if you could comment on a story I heard this morning about a woman who was arrested for a property crime, and the way they identified her was through DNA from her rape kit many years before. And now the prosecuting attorney is considering throwing out the charges because he feels it was an unethical way to identify a criminal.
That seems to be crossing some lines there. Yes, getting into, I had not heard that story. That's very interesting. I mean, on the face of it, that description seems like that is crossing the line there, especially something for a property crime. It's just pretty low. I mean, I don't know what the crime was, but that seems fairly low level, where the stakes are fairly low, and doing something like, violating her privacy essentially. And I don't know if she was anonymous before or what the circumstances were, but on the face of it, that does not seem like something they should do.
What was your process for doing research about the anatomy riots? How did you find out about them?
I don't remember exactly. There was with almost all the stories that I find, there's, a paragraph in a book somewhere that just mentions them briefly, and I think, whoa, that's incredible. I didn't know about that. And so I have to start hunting through footnotes in the book, and then going to a journal, hunting through more footnotes. And eventually you get to a paper somewhere, in a scholarly journal, or you find out there's an archive somewhere, you can go do some research, something like that. But in virtually every case, I just read some small snippet and started hunting through footnotes, and you have to be a little dogged in the pursuit of those kind of things. So I'm pretty sure that's where that came from, was just a line or two in a book that I read somewhere.
Hi, thanks. Fascinating. I want to read quite a few of your books. My name is Molly, and I'm just curious. It brought me back to remembering I think it was called pathology in psych class before I became an occupational therapist. And I read several books of Oliver Sacks, and there were several people that thought what he was doing was unethical. He didn't name the people, but were you interested in those studies, and what did you think of them?
Yeah, so my book, The Dueling Neurosurgeons, looks at some of those cases. Those were, I think mine's a little broader in that I'm looking at, vision, emotion, things like that. Some things that, his is a little narrower, I think. Mine's a little broader. But yeah, I think they're fascinating cases. And I understand kind of why people would have qualms about it, but he didn't use their names, and I'm fairly certain he changed identifying details about the patients as well, so that if, there's a story in there about someone who was a drummer. Maybe he was not a drummer in real life, he was a saxophonist or something. So he changed enough details, I think, to keep them anonymous. Can you give a little context what Oliver Sacks was? Oliver Sacks was a famous neurologist, wrote for The New Yorker for a long time, and he would have cases of people. Probably his most famous book was The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And he couldn't recognize his wife anymore. He thought, and when it was time to go, he grabbed her face and tried to put it on his head because he just couldn't recognize objects and faces anymore due to brain damage in very certain parts of his brain. So it's a collection of cases like that he has seen in his practice, and that he just wrote about, a collection of these cases. So.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I noted you're down. We got some books. What I just want to share is that John told me that there are 25 people checking in from remotely. So you
that's
have
great.
a bigger audience.
Okay. Well, hello
Thank
all
you.
out there.
Thank you.
I was a history of science major, so
Okay.
One thing that you pointed out with the Icepick Surgeon is, you get into one theory and you invest years of your life, and it's your theory and then your name's on it, so you have that tunnel vision you're speaking of. And I've been watching the show Dope Sick, which is about OxyContin and the opioid epidemic, and how that company invested so much money in this one drug that it was almost like they had to be successful. And so the tunnel vision came from, we're sunk if this doesn't work. And so they really seemed to believe, like, we're gonna cure the world of pain, and they really believed in it, and they, you know, and there was so much self-delusion, but, you know, clearly there was greed involved, but they're like, this has gotta work, so we have to believe in it, and we have to sell it, and we have to do whatever it takes, and that's what they did. And so my question to you is that one of the things we're coming to in the future is that it's all the millions of dollars, whether it's from private or government, that they're gonna have that tunnel vision because they're gonna be so invested in something that they need to succeed with it.
Yeah, you do. I had not thought about that comparison between the scientists in the book and something like this company. But I think you're right. I think that you do see a similar sort of tunnel vision. Whether it would be more in the future or not, I don't know, because I see cases of it happening in the past as well. So I don't know if there's necessarily reason to believe there would be more in the future or not. It could be. I mean, sometimes you have people, you know, you see, it seems to be, there's a bit of a startup culture where you're making a big bet on one thing. Theranos was another example with Elizabeth Holmes, where that had to work, that absolutely had to work. So maybe actually, now that I'm kind of thinking out loud here, but yeah, maybe because there is a lot at stake, and that idea has been sort of lionized or romanticized, that you start with a small company, it gets really, really big, and you can do it. You can be a billionaire from essentially nothing. So maybe we will see more of that when you have people gambling everything on one idea or something, and it has to work like that. So it's possible.
Well, I want to thank you, Mr. Kean, for just a wonderful presentation. As you know, our typical agenda is that after the Q&A, we have our social hour, and this time it's going to be a bit different because we're going to be having our book drawing before the social hour, correct? Right now.
Okay.
And then the social hour we're going to have, it's going to be a combination book signing by Mr. Kean. We have all of his titles here, I believe, plus several volumes of his new book about the Icepick Surgeon. And so we're going to have beverages available. We're going to have snacks. And everybody's welcome to join us and have a chance to socialize during this time of COVID and get to know each other again. You'll have an opportunity to talk to Mr. Kean. He'll be at a table signing books. So is Christine, are you doing the drawing, or? Let's give him a round of applause. And here's Marcy with our
Cauldron, okay.
Our bowl of all the winners, or potential winners. And you're going to do the drawing? I pick. You pick, she holds, okay.
We're a team.
All right. First lucky winner, Karen Hattlestead. Yay.
I just want to mention one thing, that Sam will personalize the books for you afterwards.
Nice. And Nancy Ruland. And last one, Michelle Lucy. Yay.
You'll be able to claim her books at the social hour and the book signing. So if anybody else, no one else has a question, we'll go right to the social hour and the book signing. Okay. Thanks so much, Mr. Kean.